Just a few moments tonight, we're going to bless his name together for who he is. Bless his name.
Bless his name. Bless his name. Bless his name.
For who he is.
For who he is.
I will bless his name.
Bless his name.
Help me bless his name.
Bless his name. Bless his name.
For who he is.
For who he is.
Just one more time, bless him.
Bless his name.
I will bless his name.
Bless his name. Bless his name.
For who he is.
For who he is.
I will worship him.
Worship him.
I will worship him.
Worship him. Worship him.
For who he is.
For who he is.
I will worship him.
Worship him.
Right now I worship him.
Worship him. Worship him.
For who he is.
For who he is.
I will love his name.
Love his name.
Somebody help me love his name right now.
Love his name.
I love his name.
Love his name.
For who he is.
For who he is.
I will love his name.
Love his name.
I will love his name.
Love his name.
I will love his name.
For who he is.
Bless his name.
Bless his name.
Yes, we come to bless your name.
Bless his name.
We bless your name.
Bless his name.
For who he is.
For who he is.
Right now, bless his name.
Bless his name.
I will bless his name.
Bless his name.
Oh, bless his name.
For who he is.
I know he's a healer.
He's a healer.
Oh, he's a
He's
healer.
a healer. He's a healer.
That's who he is.
That's who he is.
He's a healer. Sing it.
He's a healer.
Oh, he's a
He's a
healer.
healer. He's a healer.
That's who he is.
That's who he is.
See, he's my redeemer.
My redeemer.
Oh, I thank you,
My
God.
redeemer.
He's my
My
redeemer.
redeemer.
That's who he
That's
is.
who he is.
Somebody sing, he's a way maker.
He's a way maker.
I know he's a way
He's
maker.
a way maker.
Oh, I know he'll make a way.
He's a way maker.
That's who he
That's
is.
who he is.
Somebody sing his name, Jesus.
He's Jesus.
Oh,
He's Jesus. He's Jesus.
yes, that's who he is.
That's who he is.
I will bless his name.
Bless his name.
I will bless his name.
Bless his name. Bless his name.
For who he
For
is.
who he is.
One more time, I will bless his name.
Bless his name.
I will bless his name.
Bless his name. Bless his name.
For who he is.
For who he is.
Hallelujah, hallelujah. Thank you, Jesus. God, we praise you. We bless your name together, Lord. What a great God we serve. Lord, you are good. Sing.
Lord, you are good and your mercy endureth forever.
Lord, you are good.
Lord, you are good and your mercy endureth forever.
People from
People from every nation and tongue, from
generation
generation to generation, we worship
Lord, you are good. Sing.
Lord, you are good and your mercy endureth forever.
Lord, you are
good and your mercy endureth forever.
people from every nation.
People from every nation and tongue, from generation to generation, we worship you.
Hallelujah.
Hallelujah, hallelujah, we worship you
For who
for
you
who you
are.
are.
We worship you.
We worship you. Hallelujah, hallelujah, we worship you for who you are.
Oh, you are good.
You are good.
Yes, you are, Jesus. We praise you right now, God. We give you glory, God. Give you praise. Sing it.
You are good all the time, all the time. You are good. You are good all the time, all the time. You are good.
One more time. You are good.
all the time,
All the time.
all the time. You are good. You are good all the time,
All the
all
time.
the time. You are good.
Lift it up for you.
You are good all the time,
All the
all the
time.
time. You are good.
You are good.
You are good all the time,
All the
all the
time.
time. You are good.
People from every nation, from generation, we worship you. Hallelujah. Worship you. Oh, worship you. Hallelujah. For who you are. For who you are. Oh, you are good. Hallelujah. Take just a moment and tell God he's good. Hallelujah. Hallelujah. We praise you. Thank you, God. Thank you, God. Thank you, God. For all you brought us through, oh God, we praise you tonight, God. We give you glory. I give you glory.
I give you glory for all you brought me through. And now I'm ready for whatever you want to do.
I'm moving forward.
Moving forward to follow after you. And now I'm ready for whatever you want to do.
See for his presence. We can feel him right where you're at today. Oh, we thank you, God, for visitation tonight. Oh, right now, I know a breakthrough is coming. By faith, I see a miracle.
My God made me a promise and it won't stop now.
Sing, I know.
I know a breakthrough is coming. By faith, I see a miracle. My God made me a promise and it won't stop now.
Come on, let's lift it up. I know.
I know a breakthrough is coming.
By
By
faith,
faith, I see a miracle.
my God.
My God made me a promise and He won't stop now.
Right now in your home, sing it. I know.
I know a breakthrough is coming.
We're gonna have a
By
breakthrough.
faith, I see a miracle.
My God.
My God made me a promise and He won't stop now.
Oh, let's thank him right now. Let's thank him for that breakthrough. Let it be a word of faith in your mouth right now. Hallelujah. Come on, church family. Pray for one another. You may not be in the same room tonight, but God's presence is with each and every one of us. Your presence
Your presence
is an open door.
open door.
We want you.
Want you, Lord, like never before.
Your presence
Your presence
is an open door.
open door.
So come now,
Now, Lord, like never before.
oh, your presence
Your presence
is an open
open
door.
door.
We want you, Lord.
Want you, Lord, like never before.
Your presence
Your presence
is an open door.
open door.
So come now, Lord.
Come now, Lord, like never before.
Welcome into Midweek Bible Study tonight. Appreciate you joining us on this Wednesday evening. And we are excited because this is our first service where we have been able to deliver the DVD on time for them to watch this with us on Wednesday evening. So we welcome all of our Harvest Church family with us tonight for our Midweek Bible Study. We're actually, I was going to do a series on Christian living, and in prayer this week, the Lord began to give me some insight and what I need to do next. And that is, I'm going to do a series on Moses. So tonight is going to be an introduction to that series. I want you to imagine with me some scholarly historian in the distant future probing some ancient archives and peering into dim and dusty records for clues about a life in your past. And as he lays all the puzzle pieces on the table, the faded the photographs, the curled pages of a journal, the accounts of your driving record and credit reports, he begins to draw conclusions about who you were and what you were all about. What factors might the researcher consider as he pulls together his report? Well, if he's wise, he will remember that you are a product of your time. All of us are. That's an important point to keep in mind when you're considering anyone's life. We cannot and we must not separate a person from his or her times. One moment in history and our unique individual circumstances become the anvil upon which our character is beaten out and formed. We're either going to rise to the challenge of the times, or we will remain stuck to the sidelines of this time. Moses became God's man for a transitional period in history. When the divine call came to assume a crucial role in the destiny of men and nations, Moses steps into the gap. He may have been reluctant, he may have been frightened, he may have been filled with regret and self-doubt, but in the end, he yielded and he became God's instrument in his own generation. And I'm here to tell you today, it is the same in this generation. At this pivotal moment in history, God is still looking for the man or woman who will believe him despite weaknesses and doubts and become a mighty tool in his hand and an instrument for his purpose. Baby Moses opened his eyes on a world very different from his own. And a very different world from our own today. Although neither his mother nor father knew it, the birth of this man-child launched a series of events that would change the course of nations and shape the destiny of millions. History would turn like a hinge on that birth. The world would never be the same again. The very title of the book where Moses' story begins, it tips us off to what the great and climatic events that would follow. Exodus. The word means departure or going out. And that certainly describes the major theme of the second book of the Old Testament. It records the departure of the Israelites from Egypt, where they had lived for more than 400 years. They had entered the land as a little family. They exited as a huge nation. When Pharaoh finally let God's people go, they took their leave of Egypt and began what turned out to be a long, long journey to their own land, the land of Canaan. Exodus records great events, and it also records lots of drama. It actually continues the book of Genesis with a lapse of several centuries in between. Exodus picks up where Genesis leaves off, some 350 years later, but it does pick up. And the connection between those two books is one of the most fascinating accounts of all of history. And so tonight, I want to connect the two books, if you don't mind. The main character toward the end of Genesis is a man by the name of Joseph. All of us have heard of Joseph, hated and mistreated by jealous brothers. Joseph is kidnapped as a naive teenager and sold as a slave to a passing caravan bound for Egypt. And through time and a chain of incredible events, God greatly would honor this young man and promote him out of slavery, out of the grip of an Egyptian dungeon, to the right hand of Pharaoh himself. And against all odds, he became the prime minister of the most powerful nation in the ancient world. And here's the big surprise. Joseph, the remarkable ex-slave who rose to such stellar heights of power and prestige, was a Jew, a Hebrew like his father and brothers. And what a name this young man made for himself. If you know the story, you know, time and again, Joseph shows his brilliance. God would give him insight to handle vast and perplexing situations. Pharaoh quickly recognized this and exalted Joseph, putting him in charge of the agriculture and the economy of the nation of Egypt. And it was a good thing, too, because just at that time, a terrible famine would sweep the land. Warned by God, Joseph saw it coming and prepared for it. Not so with Jacob and his sons back in Canaan, however. They would have died of starvation had they stayed put. Instead, several of them traveled to Egypt, seeking grain, and eventually came before the ruler of that land. Their own long-lost brother, their younger brother, would be the ruler of that land. And after a warm and moving family reunion, Joseph invited his brothers and father to move to Egypt so that they might enjoy the plenty of grain and a fine spread of land where they could raise their crops and graze their flocks as well. If you hope to appreciate the Exodus, you have to understand how the Hebrews got to this land, and it was a foreign land, and how they got there in the first place. The children of Jacob were not made for Egypt. I want you to remember that. The children of Jacob were not made for Egypt. They were made for Canaan, that rich and renewed land of promise that awaited their return. Pharaoh responded to the arrival of Jacob's family with open and generous hands. Let's look at it together. Genesis 47, verses 5 through 6. Then Pharaoh said to Joseph, "Your father and your brothers have come to you. The land of Egypt is at your disposal. Settle your fathers and your brothers in the land, in the best of the land. Let them live in the land of Goshen. And if you know any capable men among them, then put them in charge of my livestock." Interesting. What an outstanding offer. It reveals how highly Pharaoh regarded his right-hand man. The king said to Joseph, "Your family has come." That's wonderful. Give them the best of the land. That's what he's telling him. He said, let them settle in Goshen. Let them graze their animals and help me to tend my own livestock while they're at it. I accept them wholeheartedly, Joseph. That's what Pharaoh is saying here. Because of Pharaoh's kindness, Joseph could welcome his family to this alien land and provide them with a beautiful layout beyond anything that they might have imagined, folks. He told them in Genesis 50 and 21, "So therefore do not be afraid. I will provide for you and your little ones." So he comforted them and spoke to them. But as great as it was, the king's great offer of refuge and provision wasn't the most amazing part of this story. Even more remarkable was the lack of bitterness in the heart of Joseph toward his brothers who had hated and mistreated him. He said to them, "Don't worry, be at peace. Everything's okay. Come on in. I'll take care of you and your families." And so through such strange and marvelous circumstances, the sons of Israel came to live in Egypt. And at that time, of course, they were only an extended family, a small band of bewildered refugees, if you will. You could have loaded the whole tribe on a couple of Greyhound buses. But since this kind of transport wasn't available, obviously, these brothers and their elderly father gathered their belongings together and began the long walk to the south. Yet, even when they arrived at the border as foreigners, the Egyptians didn't stick them in some fenced-off refugee camp to squeak out a meager living and just say, do the best you can. No, they were given choice real estate. It was a prime slice of Egyptian heartland. While they might live, and it says, I want you to live here, and I want you to raise your families in peace. And so for about 71 years after this radical relocation, life rolled along like the lazy Nile River, if you will. Scripture tells us in Genesis 47:22, Joseph stayed in Egypt, he and his father's household, and Joseph lived 110 years. Now, Joseph was probably, they're telling us, 39 years old when his family sets up shop in Egypt. He lived for 71 years after that and then breathed his last. The very last verse of the book of Genesis tells us, so Joseph died at the age of 110 years, and he was embalmed and placed in a coffin in Egypt. That worthy man's quiet passing marked the beginning of the end of the good life for the Hebrews in Egypt. And so with Joseph lying in his coffin, life began to change for these transplanted Jews. Subtle changes at first, and they usually are, but soon the Israelites' their fortunes would plunge like the stock market on a bad day, all the way to the bottom. And by this time, the population of Jews in Egypt had exploded. The offspring of Jacob's sons grew in number until they became a mighty people in Egypt, to the growing dismay of Egyptian officials. With Joseph no longer on the scene to represent and put in a good word for his kinfolk, the Egyptian attitude toward these foreign Hebrews continued to sour. The native population began to look upon Israel with narrowed eyes and growing suspicion. And as we know all too well from our world's bloody history, mounting suspicion toward a people group is only one step away from prejudice. and yet another step away from persecution, but a stone's throw away from genocide. Where did that prejudice come from? I think we can identify at least two sources for it. Many years before, Joseph warned his brothers about something very specific in the Egyptian culture, and it's a little thing easy for us to miss, and I strongly suspect that the brothers of Joseph missed it too. Joseph said to his brothers and to his father's household, let's look at it together, Genesis 46:31. When Pharaoh calls you and says, what is your occupation? You shall say, your servants have been keepers of livestock from our youth, even until now, both we and our fathers, that you may live in the land of Goshen, for every shepherd is loathsome to the Egyptians. So Jesus told them, let me put it in Seth Wilkerson words, maybe you can understand this. Whatever you do, guys, don't tell Pharaoh you're shepherds, okay? Keep that part under your hats, all right? Just tell him you're keepers of the livestock. Now, why would he say that? Because Joseph knew that shepherds were loathsome to the Egyptians. Let me add a little background here. At that time, the Egyptian culture had risen to, I would call, a high water mark. Its residents were expected to display a certain level of sophistication. The Egyptians advanced hieroglyphics, their fine universities, and their enviable economic situation. It made them to all look down upon any refugees or foreigners who might corrupt their good fortune. And they certainly didn't want to import a group of lowly shepherds who could tarnish their nation's high image. So shepherds were the lowlifes. They were strictly bush leaguers, okay? And to use the shepherd word at this tender point in the relationship with Pharaoh would definitely mean starting off on the wrong sandal, okay? Think back to the days when portions of America's West was being settled, and you would get a similar picture. Beef barons and sheep ranchers competing for land and profits, and these guys never joined the same bowling teams, I can promise you that, okay? If you visited a cow town, you didn't walk into a crowd of cowboys and announce, I'm a shepherd, and I got a big flock of woolies out here grazing on the outskirts of town. You just wouldn't say those things. One of the cowboys would probably sniff in the air and say, I smell sheep, and at that point, you would need to either fight, duck, shoot, or run, and do it very fast, whatever you chose to do, Pharaoh, apparently, he ran cattle, and while Jacob's boys were sheep herders, Joseph told them, he said, look, when the king asks you what you do for a living, just let them know you handle livestock. Keep it generic and it'll be okay. Don't announce that you're shepherds. Now, sadly, these guys, I'm telling you, they either forgot their brother's advice or they might have disregarded it and said, he don't know what he's talking about. When Pharaoh asked them, he said, I want you to name your occupations. They piped up, your servants are shepherds, just as our fathers were. Are you kidding me? And so as time passed, the growing number of Jewish shepherds became an issue with a capital I among the people of Egypt. That's one source, I believe, of the prejudice the Israelites eventually ran up against. But I believe something even deeper than that caused some real issues and probably the real problems. The first chapter of Exodus reveals a strong second reason why times became so hard for the Hebrews. Not only were they tenders of sheep in a land that hated shepherds, but Scripture tells us in Exodus chapter 1 and verse number 8, now a new king arose over Egypt who did not know Joseph. The day came after the deaths of Joseph and Pharaoh who had promoted him that a new Pharaoh would step onto the throne. He too ruled and then passed the crown to a new Pharaoh. Finally, after several centuries, the new Pharaoh, the name Joseph was basically virtually unknown to him. He didn't know who that was. No one remembered the famine. No one recalled the golden oceans of stored grain in the barns. And no one remembered how a wise young Jewish prime minister by the name of Joseph had stepped out of obscurity to save the day. That was ancient history now. It was irrelevant. And the bilateral policy that had been established between Joseph and some long-gone Pharaoh, well, that was completely forgotten. This new Pharaoh despised the growing Hebrew population. How had they come to be there? No one knew for sure. The reports had been filed away in some forgotten basement archive. But one thing about these multiplying Hebrews could not be ignored. They seemed to pose a threat. And I'll just put it this way. A threatened Pharaoh is never a pleasant Pharaoh to have around. And he said to his people in Exodus chapter 1, verses 9 through 10, "Behold, the people of the sons of Israel are more and mightier than we. Come, let us deal wisely with them. Or else they will multiply, and in the event of war, they will also join themselves to those who hate us and fight against us and depart from the land." And so a whole new way of life would come to pass for the Hebrews. Notice the change. It's a sad scene. Exodus 1:11. "So they appointed taskmasters over them to afflict them with hard labor, and they built for Pharaoh storage cities, Pithom and Ramses." As I read these words, I can't help but recall the dark days prior to World War II, when the fortune of the Jewish people in another land, Germany, changed so drastically under a hateful new ruler named Adolf Hitler. Not only were Jews murdered and huddled into death camps, they were also forced into cruel corporate slavery by some of the Reich's largest companies, housed in inhumane conditions. Many of these modern-era slaves were simply worked to death. Exit ease, abundance, and prosperity for the Israelites, but enter the taskmasters and the whip. And before anyone could figure out what had gone wrong and what do you do next, the taskmasters are on the scene like an angry mob. Gone were the days of shepherding. So then they were to make bricks under the snarl of slave drivers and the crack of the lash. And so it might have remained until the Hebrews were ground into the Egyptian dust. But Scripture says in Exodus 3:23, and I read from the NIV, "The Israelites groaned in their slavery and cried out, and their cry for help went up to God." God heard that cry. He had not been sleeping. His attention had not drifted. He well remembered his promise to the sons and daughters of Jacob way back centuries before Exodus chapter 1. God spoke to Adam, the father of the Hebrews, and unveiled a prophecy regarding that man's descendants. God said to Abram, God said to Abram, not God didn't speak to Adam, God spoke to Abram. Let me correct that. He said, "Know for certain that your descendants will be strangers in a land that is not theirs, where they will be enslaved and oppressed 400 years. But I will also judge that nation whom they will serve, and afterward they will come out." That's an Exodus with many possessions. A deliverer would come, a man handpicked by God himself, a leader uniquely prepared to deal both with the Israelites and the Pharaoh himself. And his name would be Moses. And this is who we're going to study about, because God did not want his people to stay in bondage. He did not want them to be oppressed. He wanted them to live in Canaan, and he had promises to fulfill. And so I want to encourage us to, we're going to study the book of Exodus together, and we're going to look at a man by the name of Moses and what took place for the children of Israel and pulling things out. Next week, I'm going to teach to you on the subject, misery, midwives, and murders. Misery, midwives, and murders. And we're going to look at this first chapter of Exodus, and we will begin at Exodus chapter 1, verses 12 through 13. Now, as we prepare to close this out tonight, let me also mention that if you've not sent in your offering to the Gracians, but you want to be a part of that offering, I need you to contact me immediately, because we are sending that check. And I also want to mention that you can also give online, harvesthumboldt.com. That's harvesthumboldt.com. Your tithe, the Lord's offerings. We have done very well over the last, I would say, 2 weeks. Our giving is back to where it was, and I appreciate you being mindful of that, because the bills do keep coming due, even though the utility bill is not the same, thank God, because we're not using the building as much. But we are still having to pay utility bills and make sure that maintenance on the church is done, and we're still cleaning the building. And so I appreciate you continuing to give, and so we want you to be aware that your giving is not going unnoticed or is not being done in vain, that there are still things that we have to do, church insurance and that sort of thing. Thank you so much for being a part of this tonight. You're seeing on your screen how to give. You can mail those checks to 3401 Bledsoe Road, Humboldt, Tennessee 38343. You can also give online at harvesthumboldt.com. That's harvesthumboldt.com. Thank you so much for worshiping with us and being a part of Midweek Refresh on this Wednesday night. Don't forget, we have family devotion tomorrow night at 7 o'clock. Friday night, First Lady Friday with Sister Wilkerson, and she is continuing her Bible study on the favor of God. And this is not just for women. This is for all of us. She's got a lot of good things to say, and I appreciate her taking this on and doing this for us. Saturday morning, 10 a.m., Pentecostal Publishing House will be doing their Sunday school time for children. And then on Sunday morning, 10 a.m., we will be live here again, and Sunday night at 6 o'clock for our special Sunday evening Bible study time. Thank you so much for joining us tonight, and until tomorrow evening, God bless you, and hope you have a great rest of your week.